Good morning. Welcome to the next in the OCC webinar series. We are experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties with our audio, it seems. Please let us know if you're experiencing any difficulties. This webinar is Opportunities in Landscape in the K-12 Environment. As you all know, we had a statewide tornado drill this morning, so that's why we're beginning just a little bit late. So for those of you who are attending today who are looking for a certificate of attendance for AIA credit or local professional development credit if you're with a school district, please wait for the last slide before sending your request for a certificate. They will be emailed to each attendee that has requested one at the end of the webinar. So we have a few slides here because this is an AIA approved webinar. The credits are 1 point of HSW credits, and we'll move forward with our description. So the webinar will focus on these issues: understanding lead and landscape design, the difference between environmental management and maintenance, how outdoor spaces contribute to social understanding, and learning in landscapes, the convergence of outdoor classrooms and STEAM curriculum. So if you are looking for LPDC credit, the same applies to you. Please wait for the last slide before sending a request through, and that information will be provided to you at the end of the webinar. Yes, we are recording today's webinar, and you can find the webinar recording and the PowerPoint in the OFCC webinar archive. Traditionally, within a couple days of the webinar, you should receive an email from me announcing the availability. So if you have a question today, please use the question feature on the right side of your screen at any time. We will respond to the questions at the end of the webinar. So today we'd like to welcome Ed Melvin, who is a landscape architect with SHP Leading Design out of Cincinnati. So we'd like to welcome Ed. We also have Glenn Rao, who is an OFCC Planning Manager, to the webinar today. And we will begin with Ed Melvin. Good morning.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank Glenn and Sue and OFCC for inviting me today. I get to talk about something I really enjoy. As was said, I'm Ed Melvin. Some brief little description of me. One of the things that I'd like to talk about today is just the perspective of how we look at landscape. And to consider lead in our landscape design for schools and school facilities, management and maintenance of the environment and landscape, and how outdoor spaces contribute to our social understanding and our social growth as persons. So just to begin, of management and maintenance. So management is to manage, to handle or direct with a degree of skill. So this translates as guiding, and I always like to think of it as very similar to parenting. So you guide children as they develop and help them to understand being themselves in the world. So managing a landscape has a certain degree of allowance attached to it. So where you allow things to happen in the environment that naturally want to occur, and manage those and guide those in a way where they're, one, in our perspective, usable for education and children of a long variety of ages. Maintenance, on the other hand, is to maintain and to keep in an existing state. So I work with an architectural firm, so I get a lot of interaction with architects. And one of the things that I like to remind them is when they are finished with their project, the building is built, it's brand spanking new, it's at its peak. It doesn't get any better. It doesn't get any newer. And maintaining that is all about slowing down the wear and tear and deterioration of their product. As a landscape architect, when we are finished with a project, everything's planted, everybody's moved in, it's an infant. And it needs guidance and management to grow, and it takes decades, in reality, decades for a lot of plants to mature and really see the environments that we were envisioning actually come to life. Because they are alive. We deal with live and living designs which require this management. So in LEED, so from a landscape architect's perspective, LEED is pretty short in its requirements. There are no plants required in LEED. You can plant grass and get all your LEED points. But I don't think that really adheres to the intention of it. Just to go quickly through some of the credits, the sustainable sites credit, rainwater management to reduce the rainwater quantity. And a lot of these are kind of managed by the civil engineers on the project. And a lot of times my role is to influence how they go about providing these and improve rainwater quality. The quality one is becoming easier to get, as we were talking just briefly before this. This year, the Ohio EPA new requirements on stormwater quality come into effect, which will, I think, significantly enhance our ability to get some bioswales and in some areas of planting and soil where the water is cleaned in a natural way before it goes into our storm systems. So, and that's kind of coming up. So I see that as a really great opportunity to develop landscapes on our institutional sites. Another credit is the protect and restore habitat. This is a kind of a crafty one. It says 30% of the site using native and adaptive vegetation. Adaptive vegetation is a pretty broad category of plants. I tend to lean towards native as regionally as possible. In ways in which, because a lot of times when we're in discussions early on of do we want to go for this credit and that sort of thing, a lot of times the first thing is mentioned is, oh, that means we have to plant a lot. It's going to cost a lot of extra money. But there's a lot of ways to look at what the habitat is and how do you develop it. So there isn't a timeline of when that habitat has to be mature. So it can be simply as starting to identify areas of the site that, one, are not utilized for a specific purpose. So it's not a sports field, it's not a parking lot, it's not a building, it's not circulation or any of that. So one, stop mowing. Just don't mow those areas. And when you seed them over with a blend of grasses that tend to be more native. And if you're not mowing, depending on the type of habitat you would like to grow, let things happen. It comes back to allowing things to happen in the landscape. Open space, this is really one of the easiest ones to get on the school site because, open space. Typically, I almost always get this. There's some urban schools that make it a little difficult too, but 30% of the site that's not building or hardscape surfaces is, you get a couple fields and open space and detention basin on your site, and you've made that credit. Water efficiency, I almost, probably 99% of the time, I get this credit because you should be selecting your plant material to grow and thrive in the environment as it is without an irrigation system. So really the only irrigation systems we ever get involved in revolve around competition sport fields. Some perspectives on your site. So when you're looking at how the landscape can interact with the school and the development, some kind of simple understandings. Where are you located? What kind of slopes do you have in your topography? What kind of opportunities do they offer? Basic weather. We all like to think we know weather, but it's to think through how those things really affect what we're growing. Structures, are you lucky enough to have natural water system flowing through your site? What kind of existing vegetation do you have? How does all this play a part in security of your site? Urban sites, some of my favorite are urban sites, just because there's such a huge diversity of everything. So there's a diversity of the environment, and if you don't do a whole lot in an urban situation, all kinds of things will just show up and grow. You really have some things that in other areas don't have. It's also a very diverse population that visits, surrounds, interacts with your site. Suburban, I believe, is one of the difficult ones in that from a plant perspective, the diversity goes way, way down. And not a lot of allowing things to happen occurs in the suburban region. Everything is very highly maintained. In a rural standpoint, you're back into diversity, but a lot of times the population is very scattered, and just from a school perspective, that it really becomes less interacted with in after hours type of thing. So in flip of that, in an urban site, a lot of times the school site becomes also a park. So there's a lot more of a population diversity in that. Or rural is limited. So one thing also to look at are what are the kind of really unique things that may occur on your site. So on the slide on the right where this tree is, you would say, oh, I want to cut that down. But it offers from an environmental standpoint and also from an educational standpoint, if it's in a place where it's not interacted with closely, so if a limb falls, no one's going to be under the tree in particular. What it does offer is it's a great haven for wildlife. It's also just unique from landscape. It's not always about kind kind of developing environment where animals and insects and birds and that live. It's also inspiration for our work being creative. So from an art perspective or a creative perspective, a writing perspective, these kinds of things can be very helpful in the development of all those regions, whether it's painting or, writing a story. What's the story of this tree? How did it get to be like it is? And social understanding. So from this kind of flips to taking education outside of the classroom, and what does an outdoor classroom offer in a way that is very difficult to mimic inside. So this kind of develops as, the centerpiece of education is the development of a person. And it's a group of children, but as a person, and connectively and collaboratively. So in a classroom, collaborative development happens less intuitively than it does on the exterior one, where a lot of times children are allowed to have a little bit more freedom when they're outside doing things. So they naturally collaborate in doing things. The connectivity is they really begin to understand that they are creatures of the planet, that we're not really separate and distinct from nature. We're an aspect of it. And for children to understand that and live in that, I think it's very, very powerful in their lifetime. And within just kind of how all that kind of comes together in an outdoor environment, there's active things going on, there's passive things going on, imaginative things where they play in stories, they work in stories. We're building something, we're building a castle, or we have an ice cream store today. All these things could happen in a single place, but it becomes something else because they allow it. And investigative, where, one of my favorite things as a child was to lift the rock and find out what's lived underneath it. Those investigative opportunities that, we really don't want to have the insect farm inside. Let it happen outside and allow that. You'll notice I say allow a lot in these things because that's where children have the opportunity to develop themselves as a person and their connectivity. And one of my absolute favorite quotes comes from Albert Einstein, and I'm not a math person. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. To stretch really the questioning. So what that is really all about is asking questions. So it's not necessarily knowing the answer to all the questions. So every really great question opens doors to explore, not necessarily answer in a particular way, because most questions can be answered in many, many ways. In an outdoor classroom, one of the things I've really kind of thought about for the last kind of decade or so is what they offer to children as they develop in this really tiny scientist we have in our picture, and that is the idea of secure freedom. And how I look at that is being secure within your surroundings as a person, to freely be oneself, to grow and develop. And security in this standpoint is much broader than what the world is engulfed in these current days. Security from this perspective encompasses that physical security, I'm safe, but it also encompasses that feeling of being secure enough where we allow ourselves to show who we are to the world and those we're with. That isn't always easy for children as they're developing. So it's very, in an outdoor situation, it is much more comfortable for them to do that. And also our connectivity. I love this little picture taken from Cassini, one of its last photographs, and we are the little white dot in the center of the photograph. And just a little perspective of how, as creatures, how small the really place we exist in. Collaborative learning. So collaborative learning and teamwork are not the same. Collaborative learning happens just naturally outside. So in this particular slide, they're building a fort. So they were figuring out all on their own, how are they going to build a fort out of the materials that they had, and they needed to work together, and using whose skill is what best. And children are very good at working through what their best skills are, and they just kind of naturally gravitate to what they're going to do. And to provide these kinds of things in an environment that allow them to do that. And learning landscapes. And I put STEAM up because I've never understood why STEM forgot about the arts. In particular, because of my favorite quote from Albert Einstein, in that imagination is where things begin. And you could talk to any scientist or technologist or engineer that, you know, their problem-solving skills, creativity is at the root of all of those. And to develop creativity and have projects that work on that. So the science of things, you know, as I first mentioned, landscapes are alive and always in process. They're not static. So it's an instant available laboratory to investigate in and apply the scientific method of learning. That doesn't have to happen in an enclosed laboratory. Technology, you know, today we think of technology as electronic. Well, technology are all the tools that we use to build and observe and analyze and theorize. So they're the things that we use. They're not just electronic and connected to the information way, but they can be. Engineering is putting all that technology into practice, making our creativity real in the world. Art, as I said, from my perspective, is where imagination lives and really is an umbrella over all things, education to our professions, to our living, to our kitchens, all those things. Art and creativity live everywhere in our lives. And math, of course. And I go back to Albert Einstein because he's just such a fascinating character. And at the most advanced math, in string theories and all these physics things you hear about, are like very technical, but they're all about understanding what's naturally happening around us. So it really it interacts with nature to such a rooted degree that to isolate it from the environment within which they study it, I think is something that's missing and can be brought back. An important word in education, affordance. So as we design and look at outdoor landscapes from an educational standpoint, particularly in K-12 and PK to some degree, is to design spaces, one that allows, and affordance is all about opportunities for multiple ways of things to happen and understand them. So there's some obvious ways, and my favorite illustration of affordance is a doorknob. You intuitively know what a doorknob is for. So to design spaces that offer where it gives intuitive clues about what can happen in those spaces. And this is all what to do with the landscape. Everything outside is an opportunity for learning to happen. So the simple idea of leaves. So here we do have some very young people running around in their maze, but at the same time, this could be manipulated from an older class that actually made the maze as part of their math project, part of their art study project, that they developed it where the other students get to actually utilize their work as they learned. So those kind of interconnections between ages and curriculums and understandings are very powerful. And I am not familiar with a person who does not have fond memories of leaves. So maybe we should leave them on the ground for a little while and utilize those as the opportunity that they offer. This kind of comes down to, actually I shouldn't say to a younger age, because these opportunities cross all ages. And to provide things where they can actually build. So whether it's just pieces of wood, whereas a lot of times when we're developing a new site, just the way it works out, there's a certain number of trees that come down. So instead of having that as just carted off, utilize those in the development of the spaces, whether it's as furniture or whether you keep the sticks and you refine them a little bit and they become manipulatable things as part of the education. And a PVC pipe is one of those awesome things where you can collect it and put it all together. And it can be, in science, it's like, how do we get the water from here to there without buckets? Or how do we examine erosion in our yard? So how do we guide the water to this mud and make those kinds of things? And one of my favorite things, I think it's on the next slide though. It's not, but we'll get to it. I know it's on one of them. And the importance of water outside in education. We have just a natural fondness for water. Its texture. There is nothing that feels like water. And it is, I mean, we're mostly water, but we have just an affinity for it. To do things with, and it is just astounding of the simplicity of what it is and how children can take so much from it. And simple things as puddles. What if we allowed puddles to happen? I know that's probably not, civil engineers listening are probably going like, oh no, puddles are not good. Puddles can be good. This is it. And just being outside offers the mind and the body to relax a bit and kind of decompress from all the things that come at us. So one of my favorite things, and this can be done with all ages, and it's in the center of the slide, which is shadow painting. It hits every single curriculum subject you can think of. So math, we're measuring how tall our shadow is, and then you paint it. Of course, the shadow moves. Shadows are alive. And they have a story, so they can be written about and thought of as a story. Stories in the lives and education of children are so important and just extraordinary, because really that's what we are. We live our own individual story, and to allow those stories to kind of come to life in moments. These are like moments of story that pop up for like pop-up art. And music. I've seen these sound walls that have, makeshift kind of things. They have pots and pans on them, and those are not, you don't learn a lot about sound other than sounds you don't like. Whereas just simple, organized pipes and bells, they get to make sound, which is what sound wall is all about. Is I am making an action and has a result and that result is a noise. But instead of a noise, if it's a real note, then there's a whole other level of education about what sound means. So it comes back to affordance. It affords for multiple things to be understood just by manipulating them. And the garden, of course, what this offers is caring, and the understanding that we're caretakers of our environment. We build where we live, we build where we drive, we build where we walk, we build where things are grown that we eat, which becomes us. So it really develops a personal, individual connection to soil and plants. So all aspects. One of the great things about outdoor education is that automatically touches all the senses. We don't have to make things up. It's just there. The air always has a fragrance of some sort, whether you appreciate it or don't appreciate it. It could be that you're working in the compost pile and it's not, the fragrance is a little strong. Or you're cleaning out the mint bed because it's kind of taken over. They all have their pieces to it. And they also offer an opportunity for kind of quiet space. Some children they need a space where they can go, where they're not necessarily completely segregated, but they have a place that quiets them. That can be really important when you have a large group, which all our schools are large groups of young people. They all have individual needs, and outdoor environments offer the ability for them to choose when they need that space and go to it, which are secret spaces. They're only secret spaces because they feel that way. Because one of the important things about all these outdoor environments is visibility. So it might be a secret space, but you can see into it. But it's scaled to an individual or no more than 3 individuals, where it's private, but it's also open. And a lot of times I like these next to an open area where there's a lot of running and activity and that sort of thing, because it doesn't take a lot to feel enclosed. And it's really just that feeling of enclosure. It's not actual enclosure, because you always have to have visibility. So, I mean, that's just rule number 1 of safety. Visibility, safety is a given. We shouldn't really have to say that's necessary, because we all know that when a child can't be seen, he's in the wrong place. To jump to probably middle school to high school, there's a shift in what is important to us in those ages. So as we reach teenage years, you know, all of us were teenagers. And no, I would not want to be a teenager again. But one of the things I noticed is it is such social interaction becomes such a priority in their development. And it also becomes very important, extremely important, of how they develop as a person and how they interact with groups, and whether it's, you know, they have a tight-knit group of friends, or they're a person who has, you know, groups of friends all around. But to create environments within which this social interaction can happen as they're learning. So instead of being so regimented, that there's a little bit of freedom. And with all freedoms, there is responsibility. Freedom is one of those, in my personal view, a broken word. And a lot of times it's thought of as, you know, I'm free to do whatever I feel like. That's not freedom. That's disrespect for everyone around you. Freedom means that you are free to be safely who you are and develop and grow and interact with others in a positive way that works between you. So it offers that you can interact with someone that you gain, they gain, symbiotic relationships. To have these environments for these groups of people are so important, because at this group too is to develop ownership in their spaces and in their environment, where if they have the responsibility that they own its conditioned to some degree, you get a lot more out of them. And this kind of comes back to all the garden design, where outdoor learning spaces, you know, have a little gardening to them, but they're not gardens. Gardens means you have a gardener. Landscape is much broader, and it becomes more allowing. But in those, the ideas of thresholds and pathways, and it comes where you pass between spaces. So they're moments, they're kind of moment points along the way. So a lot of the design is the story, because story is so important. The stories of along the way in our school. How do we get to not just our classroom? How do we get from our car to the door? What's the story of arrival for children? There's a scale. There's such a scale conflict because you have just the massness of all the vehicles at the beginning and ending of day. How do you manipulate just the I'm going to say it again, the story of getting there and passing between and along the way? And there's so much you can do in the landscape with that, and materials and textures and all that kind of stuff that all of us love. So this begins to think about, how do I get started, and thinking, bringing these kind of things together. And as all of us know, whether we're teachers or architects or engineers or planners, whatever it is, we start with a plan. Think through all the things about what do you want to do, where, who, what, why, all those questions, and develop that, whether it's a list or a drawing, but it's important for it to live outside of us as individuals. In order for these things to live in the school, it needs to live in the community, because schools are very community oriented, and there has to be commitment and buy-in for these kinds of things to happen, because it offers such a real diversity in expanding your curriculum to go outside the walls. So planning, I was just mentioning, begin with the questions. And this is something that also, just the development of this is in addition to your curriculum. It becomes a school project of we're gonna build us somewhere outside where we're learning. And they start with the inquiry and do the legwork and the understanding about what do we really need outside. And in today's time, it's always important, and I bring back the idea of safety and visibility, and this creeps up all the time about the idea of designing around crime prevention through environmental design, and visibility is the key thing, that we don't want to design hiding spaces. Number one, that's just one of those duh kind of moments. And the idea of just that mix of vehicles and pedestrians, and to really examine that physically in realities, what that brings to a project.
Thank you so much, Ed. We are going to, I have a reminder, if we can get this slide to move forward a little bit. There we go. So before we continue with our Q&A portion of today's webinar, just a simple reminder that if you're interested in receiving credit, you would need to have individually logged in and logged out. This provides us with digital documentation for your attendance today. And as a reminder, credit is not offered to attendees who watch a webinar in a group environment. So let's get to our questions. And the first question is, what are the first steps to recognizing our school property as valuable resources?
One is take inventory of what it really is, and its uniqueness. One, uniqueness, whether it's plant material, where it is, how it's connected. That's all about investigating your space.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. Next question. What version of LEED is the speaker referring to, version 3 or version 4?
It's kind of a blend, because some projects still are in 3, some projects are in 4. And 4 is so much different. So I kind of got both of them in there a little bit.
Okay, next question. Where can I find information for integrating my curriculum with an outdoor classroom?
So there's some great organizations, and one of them is the North American Association for Environmental Education, which is the NAAEE. And it is a group that is all about training educators on environmental education, developing lesson plans, all those sorts of things. So they have a very intensive availability list of courses that you can do online, conferences, all that is wrapped around environmental education. There's also a lot of states have their own kind of satellite group of the same. And if you're in early childhood education, the branch of the NAAEE is the Natural Start Alliance, which is all about nature preschools, which is a really great organization which covers preschools from, that have a building and do a little bit outside to all the way to some preschools that don't even have a building. And they meet outside, and school is outside every day of the entire year in Minnesota. So when I hear like, oh, we wouldn't want to go out in the rain, there are schools that are outside no matter what. So, I mean, there's such a broad range of how environment and education can be integrated.
Thank you, Ed. Next question is, what is a typical landscape installation budget for an elementary school? Gentlemen?
So that's typical is a dangerous word because when we're planning with a district in whether it's renovating a space or designing a whole new school site for them, it's very individual of a district in their philosophy of how they learn and how they manage their facilities, all come into play of how developed their landscape is. So it's such a broad range of budget.
This is Glenn Rowell. I would like to chime in on that question. I would like to propose that we try to eliminate the idea in our planning that landscape is a separate budget, at least as it relates to what Ed talked about with the relationship between education and nature, and that we start that the design process is not just about the bricks and sticks that make the physical space of the constructed building, but it includes the whatever natural component is makes sense to be a part of the project, and hopefully pedagogically. So it's always one of my concerns that I experience a lot, that on bid day, I see frequently the landscape budget, whatever it is eliminated and value engineered out. And I would hope we could come back around to the idea that nature is not a separate and distinct piece of an education facility, that it's part and parcel and must be contained, must be a part of the building that ultimately is built. And so the budget just, needs to accommodate that. And the fact that we line item a budget for landscape and then later value engineer it out, I think we have to get beyond that. To build on that real quick, if I could, Ed, I have a question. And again, it sort of builds on that. I have a personal feeling that nature is an essential human element. We build buildings that generally take ourselves away from nature on, for the average length of a day, but that nature is an essential human element. There are two projects that have really drawn a real focus to me. One is called the BRIT. I think it's the Biological Research Institute of Texas, BRIT, the BRIT. And you can look that up online, I think. It's in Fort Worth, but it's a LEED Platinum building. Closer to home, there's another one called Aileron. It's a professional think tank development workspace that professionals can go rent out and imagine for the day. But again, a LEED Platinum building. Both buildings, as you approach the buildings, it's distinct how nature is a considered part of the design of the project in your cars, and then as you get out and experience it on a more human level. Critical parts of, again, the design of the building. So the building is not just the bricks and sticks. So my question is, do you have any knowledge or aware of material that research that goes to this idea that nature is an essential human element, that we need to interact with nature regularly on an ongoing basis?
Oh, well, that research is everywhere, and a lot of times that's kind of what we try to mimic in our buildings when they're LEED, is to allow some of the freshness of outside enter our spaces, but in a very controlled way. But it comes down to, and I don't have I can't send you to a paper. In a day or so, I could send you to a couple of sites that have, volumes of this aspect. And one, from an educational standpoint, the NAEE has just a library of professional papers on how it really affects the physical, emotional, intellectual development of children by being outside. And I think all of us it's kind of instinctive that when we're kind of just not right in some way, we want to go spend some time outside. It's very instinctive. Sometimes I think we forget our own instincts because we spend too much time in our mind. That way we should allow our instincts to take over.
Awesome discussion. Thank you. We have another question from one of our attendees, and it is, do you find your school clients still favor direct door access to outdoors from pre-K and kindergarten level classrooms to exterior play, art, dining, or performance spaces?
Absolutely. In particular, between PK and K, the majority of school districts prefer direct access from the classroom to their outside space. Absolutely.
Perfect. And our final question is, I work in a very urban school with little opportunity for landscape. How can our school incorporate landscape into our smaller schoolyards? So you would think I'm a landscape architect that urban spaces would not be, my favorite, but they are one of my favorites because you really have to be crafty about what you do because you are limited in space. But also,
the very little bit you do goes such a long way with it. So in an urban situation, the simple act of planting a tree can be so much to an environment, because when you think of all the things we can do for the environment, planting trees is number one. Trees and water are the things that are environmental changers.
Perfect. Well, we are going to get to the point where we are going to end this webinar, but I wanted to first share with you some contact information for Ed and for Glenn. If you have questions for these gentlemen, please feel free to reach out to them directly. If you may also have a question that OFCC can answer, please feel free to send those to info@ofcc.ohio.gov. And now comes the time for everyone who's interested in receiving credit. This concludes our course for today, and the contact information for submitting your request for AIA credit, LPDC credit, or just a certificate of participation, please send them to me at sue.meyer@ofcc.ohio.gov. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you join us for a future OFCC webinar.